Actually, I'm enjoying lockdown. This is what Marx talked about, where you work in the morning, you spend time with the family, you cook, you listen to music, and it's unalienated labor. So
Yes.
I'm loving it. See, because I think these technologies have been around. People have not been using them out of sheer lethargy and resistance to the new. And now we are forced to use it, and we're realizing the problems, and hopefully the technology will get better. And you'll also be able to integrate it with, because you see, a lot of this depends on the fact that, academics have an exaggerated notion of their charisma, that they have to be present in a classroom and so on. And actually what you see is that we are able to actually now reach out beyond the university. Because once you put all of this online, otherwise university is an exclusive space. People have to pay huge amounts of money to get in. And now all of this is up on the net for anybody to watch.
Yeah.
I think fundamentally something democratic that is happening right now. So, while I'm kind of skeptical about these, massive online courses and so on in a theoretical sense, but I can understand the value of reaching out to more than 30 people in a class. It makes sense.
So maybe, that is where I started. I wanted to start our conversation. That probably, but in disguise, this lockdown is a way to diffuse the prevalent academic politics, that exclusive spacing, that quasi-Brahminical domain, with the new Brahmins at work trying to decide who will be eliminated. So how do you see what kind of academic politics would emerge in the aftermath, if we have an aftermath of this pandemic?
I wouldn't be so dystopian in my view. I do think that there is something good that will emerge out of this, because, one has to keep in mind that when we talk about experience under lockdown, that is hugely differentiated. Right? This is something that we all recognize. So one has to take into account the fact that a lot of people still don't have access to the internet, and facilities to study are very fragmented. It's moving along the fault lines of caste and class and so on and so forth. But keeping that in mind, I think fundamentally, what it has allowed is that one option that did not exist in a classroom is that you have a teacher who believes that what they say is wisdom and makes no effort to make it even entertaining, appealing, interesting, and so on. Here with something like this, you just shut it off and you go your own way. And so there's a compulsion to be not only to be knowledgeable, but to make that knowledge relevant and to appear to be relevant yourself.
Yes.
And the second thing is what we talked about earlier, is that once all of these webinars are available, all of these lectures are available, of course, it's like a virus, right? The webinars are spreading, really like at viral speed.
Right.
But if you think about our conception of a university, the public university in India is under siege, right? Because of a certain form of politics. There is a kind of retreat into private universities, which actually means that very few people have access to that kind of education. A lot of the private universities are excellent. You think about Ashoka, South Asia, Shiv Nadar, and so on. But what this allows us to do is to, if you think about one of the most popular series on the internet, the Salman Khan Maths Academy, right? It has revolutionized. I don't mean the actor Salman Khan, right? There is a Salman Khan, the mathematics teacher. And it allows students all over the world, so long as they have access to internet, to engage with the difficulties of mathematics. And mathematics, it's usually a psychological barrier as well. People feel that they are less able to handle numbers, but the Salman Khan Academy has revolutionized that. And similarly, we need to rethink the role of the university within an academic space, within a pedagogic space. Think about how a fundamental new democratic pedagogy can emerge, where the access to knowledge is not confined to a room, and access to that room is regulated by financial access, right? And financial wherewithal. So I think there is a lot to be said for what is happening under lockdown. And these are some of my thoughts. And I tend to be generally of an optimistic temperament. So I try to think with what is possible with the situation. Now, of course, as an academic, as academics, we are able to present both sides of the case. So if you were to ask me to present a criticism of my position, I could, but this is what I want to say for the moment.
With this, I suppose there would be also new currency to globalism. I mean, something which you have engaged with as far as global South Asia is concerned, global South is concerned. Also, the category of blackness probably would acquire more global currency, and it would get conjoined with some of the other kind of categories such as casteness or communalness or so and so forth. Right. So, and that would require a different kind of pedagogic sensibility to not transact any kind of content in very specifically confined manner. It would require us, the teachers and scholars, to move back and forth across boundaries of various kinds.
I think this is a very important point that you're raising, because it is raising the question of newness, right? Because we are in an unparalleled situation. I don't think any of us has experienced something like this in our lifetime. So I think it's important that we bring that to bear on what we teach, what we reflect on, and to also think about the connectedness of the world in a way that we have not thought about earlier. We are still stuck with the paradigms of the nation state. We study something called Indian sociology. We study something called Indian history. We don't look at the connections. The virus has reminded us that the world is connected, right? The virus is traveling across borders fairly easily, regardless of passport regimes and attempts at state control. But you're also reminded that the virus travels within bodies, right? So unlike bacteria, which don't require a host, the virus requires a host. And bodies are stopped at borders. So we are immediately reminded that alongside the unparalleled spread of the virus, there is the boundedness of the possibility of travel of the human body, which is black, which is casted, which is gendered, which is sexualized, and so on and so forth. So if you keep that in mind, what the present conjuncture allows us to think is the fact that even as there is a globalized condition, there is something that is very differentiated in this, that we experience lockdown differently. And those who are on the wrong side of power are experiencing the brunt, not only of authoritarianism, but also of neglect and of abandonment. We've seen this happen with migrant labor. We've seen this in attacks directed against people who look different in India, right? So Northeasterners and a lot of the nursing community happen to be Christians. They are under attack. People in the United States, the Chinese have been under attack. Black Lives Matter has acquired a potent force. And this, again, is very interesting. And this is something that I've been thinking about a lot. I mean, how a metaphor actually then translates into an actual human condition. If you think about George Floyd, his last words, "I can't breathe." Yes. This is what COVID does. This is what the virus does. The virus attacked our very ability to breathe, which is why I think Black Lives Matter has surfaced again, right? Because that "I can't breathe" addresses a moment in world history right now, which actually generalizes a human condition. Right, and speaks to a human condition. So America, the kind of racial politics that has emerged is something that has not been seen for the last 50 years since the civil rights movement. Right? So that's important to think about. So what you're saying about blackness, casteness, in South Africa too, there's been a lot of police brutality. In India, of course, needless to add, there is police brutality. That has been the function of the police in Indian society, to be brutal on the behalf of property classes, upper castes, and so on and so forth. So I think what we need to think about here with the pandemic and with COVID-19 and the crisis is that what it has allowed us to see is that there are forms of abjection in the world that are connected. And how do we think about that? How do we bring that into our classroom? And jettison also the kind of temporalities of nation states. There is this foolishness in India where modern Indian history stops at 1947 and then it becomes political science. After 1947, it becomes sociology. After 1947, and so on and so forth. Yeah. And a lot of these ludicrous reorganizations of knowledge, which have resulted from a certain decolonizing movement, we need to actually think beyond this, the fact of global migration. Right? I mean, if you think about a state like Kerala, for example, the fact that Kerala is now had flattened the curve, but now with the return of migrants from the Gulf going up again, and you realize that Kerala is actually part of a geography that includes the Indian Ocean and West Asia. It's not really a geography connected to North India or the northeast of India and so on and so forth.
Exactly.
So it's a multiple fragmentation of geographies, and yet the connectedness. I mean, there are multiple issues here that could actually fundamentally transform the way we do our tired teaching in our universities.
Two things which emerged from what you said. One is about the nature of historiography in this kind of situation. I mean, what kind of historiography? I mean, there has been debate about historiography for a long time, but probably this kind of crisis also enables us to revive that debate and take it forward from here, rather than just leaving it as a discursive domain where one can say all sorts of things, but eventually everybody gets back to the same old way of doing history. That is one kind of question. Second is whether this virus-affected neoliberalism will show any pathways. I mean, some people are predicting certain kind of collapse of neoliberal capitalism. Some others are also trying to suggest that there would be a certain kind of revival, which would make neoliberal state even more powerful than ever before. There would be micro-biopolitics, etc., etc. So these two kind of questions would emerge from what you said. Whichever
I think this is interesting what you're saying, and a lot of this, one can say both this and that, right? There are a lot of predictions about the end of this, that, and the other, end of capitalism, end of American hegemony, rise of Chinese, dominance in the world. And these are all, in some sense, governed by the fact that we tend to think with the present, right? And we tend to think with tired old habits, right? So, I mean, if you and I were to be woken up from our sleep, you could put down 10 predictions for the future, but that would only reflect certain habits of thinking. So I've been trying very hard, not that I have succeeded, but trying very hard to think with what is new in this situation. And I think one of the interesting things that emerged, when you talk about this idea of the neoliberal state and the era of neoliberalism and so on, there is a way in which we tend to assume that there is only one time in the world. We are all Hegelian at heart. There is one time of capital. Right? And so we have the welfare state at one point. Now it's a neoliberal state, but capitalism is seen as the all-inclusive shell within which we live. And this is something that we need to think about seriously, because the idea of the neoliberal state presumes a withdrawal of the state. There is the free reign of the market. What 2007-8, the financial crisis, reminded us was that capitalism needed somebody to hold its hand, and the state was only too willing to do so, right? I mean, you think about quantitative easing, for example, in the United States. So in that sense, state and capital still work together in very much the same ways that it has been doing for a very long time. And if you think about the current situation again, it's a state that has actually come to the aid of capital. You think about what happened in Uttar Pradesh recently, right, where 35 labor legislations were suspended, right? The state decided, because now when you think about an economy which has to be restored, you can't do that without compulsions on labor. And there's a new draconian labor regime that's emerging. So the state and capital colluded during the financial crisis of 2008. State and capital are going to arrive at a new kind of arrangement under COVID, if only to keep the economy functioning, where, of course, it's those at the bottom who will bear the brunt. That said, one of the interesting things that's also emerging is that if you think about states, countries like Germany, for example, the state is performing a new function, right? The state is performing a redistributive function where it's actually allocating large amounts of money for things like the arts and artists and culture It's also providing a kind of net, an insurance net, by providing cash to those who are in dire circumstances because of COVID-19. So in one sense, the welfare state is re-emerging in other forms. And again, we need to think about these multiple things together, which appear to be contradictory trends, but they're actually multiple ways in which states are functioning in different societies. So if you think about a largely prosperous society like Germany, governed by ideas of social democracy, the state has actually managed to redefine itself during this crisis, during COVID-19. In India, we've resorted to brutality, right? I mean, if you think about the ways in which different states have reacted, take the United Kingdom, United States, India, Brazil, where you have had populist governments come to power, where there is an emphasis on the performative. When you think about Boris Johnson and Modi and Trump, they have a lot in common. They are performative leaders of the state. That we don't have notions of pastoralism, as Foucault might put it, a pastoral care, a governmentality that is dedicated to governing populations. That's not happening in the United States, UK here, and in Brazil, in India and in Brazil, where there's been an abandonment of the poor, abandonment to the people, the use of primitive forms to make up for a lack of pastoral care. So that's another thing to think about when we think about forms of democracy, and how democracy is going to reconstitute itself, after COVID-19. So there's a whole range of questions, and I don't think our classic idea of the neoliberal state is very useful in that sense, because we are seeing this kind of compact between state and capital, which has been continuing in different ways. And in some cases where you have, like in Germany, you are seeing a different face of the state emerging, perhaps.
And all right, so the other question was unrelated, but still, if you can come on historiography, the nature of historiography.
Right, about a new historiography that may emerge. One of the things to think about really is that how exactly do we think about the globe, right? And how exactly do we think beyond nationalism and the nation state? I mean, the nation state, I can understand pedagogically, is a heuristic device, right? I mean, you need to organize a syllabus, but that can't be the conditions for producing knowledge. I can understand somebody saying, hey, we can't teach everything in class. But I think one of the important things to think about really is to think with the idea of the connectedness of the non-contiguous, right? We tend to think that things which are close to each other are more connected than things which are far apart, right? And this is something that's becoming very clear, that it's not true, that you do have the connectedness of the non-contiguous, which is really the feature of our everyday life even right now. And how do we bring that into reconceptualizing? Sorry, you were about to say something.
I was also thinking, because of the pandemic situation, we witnessed a lot of emotional upheavals. So for a very long time, even in anthropology, we have this debate whether anthropology, sociology, or history of emotions could take off in this part of the world. In other part of the world, there have been engagement with emotions and the complexity of emotion and how emotion intersects with politics and society. So probably that becomes an intellectual challenge to historians, and that requires them to revisit historiography. This is just my basic...
No, but it's a very important point, you see, because how does affect come to be redefined in a situation like this? See, one fundamental thing really has been the factor solitude, right? We tend to think with the social media, or we have been made to believe with the existence of social media, of a kind of connectedness through Facebook, Instagram, Pinterest, and so on. And if you remember the tragic suicide of Sushant Singh, a lot of people were saying, look, he had 1.86 million followers, but yet he was alone. Yes. So I think this is something that we need to think about, because one of the facts that lockdown has reminded us of the fact, and this is something that I've been speaking with colleagues as well, is that we need human bodies around us. That just to be on the road, right, and to see people, we don't realize what that does to our psyche. Right? That even now, once lockdown was over, people were out on the streets, and just the fact that there were bodies on the street was sufficient to restore a certain wholeness to oneself. So this question of individuality, question of solitude, question of affect and how you're connected to people, right? That becomes crucial here, which we need to understand. And connectedness is not really about friends and relatives and so on. It's a connectedness with unknown others, right? And that is something that the virus has reminded us. I mean, the plight to somebody in Wuhan or in Detroit has become much more consequential for us in a way that it hadn't been earlier, because this is a global crisis. When we doom scroll, when we look at the number of people dying all over the world, there is a sense that of relativity that is established. That's one thing. The second thing is that if you think about fundamental questions like life and death, if you think about death, right, the fact that if you have a relative, I mean, even let's say a parent who is unwell and who's dying, you can't go see them. And if they do pass away, unfortunately, there was a period under lockdown where all of that had to be disposed of, all the rituals that we have come to associate, right? Where you bring in a priest, you bring in lots of people. Sometimes people come in just to have a cup of tea and just smoke a cigarette. You have to organize all of this.
Yeah.
The question of grief has changed, right? Where grief and death has become more banal in some sense.
Banal.
Death is indeed banal. I mean, you cease to be. But for everybody around, it becomes a matter of ceremony. Right. But now, stripped of ceremony, we are forced to think about death differently. So there are multiple ways in which I think the question of emotions, interpersonal, the kind of emotions that actually are related to fundamental life rituals, marriage, death, birth, all of the ceremonies around it have to be dispensed with now. Right? Hopefully, this will make people rethink as well. Right? I mean, because in India, as many other countries, a lot of money is actually spent in the kind of the show of self.
Yes.
Right? So if somebody gets married, it's actually a matter between two people, but it actually becomes something where the entire community has to be feted and so on. So there's a whole set of things which actually impinge on every aspect of life rituals, which you have to think about seriously as sociologists, as historians, and so on.
Right. I was also thinking along the same line, the way we have to return to the fundamentals of relation. Likewise, probably we have to return to the fundamentals of elements. Say, for example, water, your muse water. So probably one has to rediscover some of these elements, water, air, fire.
Right.
How do you return to water at this moment? I mean, you have a body of interest.
Right. I think, what this has reminded us again. I mean, a lot of these things is not... See, it's like an idea. If one is thinking about history, one can think about history as a continuous flow, right? Which is how we study it. So that from 1757 to 1947 is an Indian syllabus, right? So there's a flow of events. But in one sense, if we think about history as constituted by interruptions, right, where you reach back, to the past in order to look at moments which resemble the present, right, which address the present, address the dangers of the present, right? It's a kind of the idea of history that Walter Benjamin talked about, right, where you're the present and you shine a light on the past and it flashes a moment that you recognize. It's that moment of recognition of affinity with certain moments of the past, right? So we're thinking about various events that have been going on, which we now recognize from our moment of crisis. So, for example, the fact of simple things, like you're saying, like the presence of the elements. Air, we take for granted. It's the one thing that you're not taxed for, you don't pay for, but it's the one thing that can be taken away from you, right? With the present COVID-19 crisis. You think about questions like touch, right? And if you think about Indian society is a society that is governed by touch and non-touch, by touch and untouchability. Right? So here again, what we need to think about when we think about the current crisis is that how are we to think about the presence of bodies, the presence of bodies within space, the movement of bodies within space, all of which are getting more and more curtailed in different ways, so that if you are wealthy or possessed of certain forms of cultural capital, you have more access to spaces of care. You can go to Medanta, for example, in Delhi and get yourself treated. And others are dying in their homes. There are recently, just yesterday, a young girl was pushed out of a bus in UP because they thought she was afflicted with COVID-19 and died as a result thereof, right? So we are thinking about multiple ways in which the fundamental facts of human being in the world are being impacted, where the question of who can be touched, who has the ability to breathe, who has the ability to move, right? You think about that extraordinary resilience, the greatest movement of humans in India since the partition. The young girl cycling with her father for 1,500 kilometers, men and women and children walking a few hundred kilometers, right? Yeah, it's extraordinary. And for us, we can be sentimental about this because the post-colonial mode is that of sentimentality towards labor. You do nothing to help them, but you kind of marvel at the tragedy of it. But the fact that there is a resilience, right, that distances don't mean anything, transport doesn't mean anything. So, which is why in an earlier talk, I used the metaphor of walking on water, that the Syrians who were in a war-ravaged zone just went across the Mediterranean as if they were walking across a pond. Right? So at a moment when we are thinking about a certain kind of resilience of human spirit, now the question we have to ask, of course, is that why are some human beings required to be more resilient than others, right? Yeah. And that is the tragedy of India. That when we say somebody went 2,000 kilometers, this is extraordinary, you say, why did they have to? You know, could they not have been provided for? Which goes back to the earlier points about the role of governments and states and pastoral care and the abandonment of people. So that's a kind of circuitous answer to what you asked me. But
it also probably deepens the class divide and gives a new dynamics to the idea of class in a pandemic-ridden society. So probably, do you foresee any kind of resurgence of class politics in India after this?
No, you see, I have never been enamored of a kind of Marxist approach to the study of India. I mean, Marxism is the opium of the intellectual classes in India, and that's another matter, because I think the fundamental divide in India is that of caste and of ascriptive hierarchy, that even somebody who rises in class bears the stain of casteness. It's what Ambedkar talked about. There's a deep biological trench that runs through India, right? Where Indians don't marry one another. It doesn't matter whether you're a Dalit who becomes an IAS officer or a Secretary of State. You can only expect to be married to a Dalit and produce more children in that category. There isn't that kind of movement in India. So for me, whether class politics is governed by the fact that India is a caste society, which believes in caste, which continues with caste, which entrenches caste in multiple ways, beginning with the arranged marriage and the matrimonial advertisements, which are really all you people need to know in a course on sociology, a page from Times of India, right?
Yes.
So given all of that, I mean, the resurgence of class politics, in another sense, will become, since you've asked me that question, when we think about the kind of labor regimes that will emerge post-COVID, right? Where state and capital are going to work together to put together draconian forms where Working hours are going to be increased. Trade unionization is going to be curtailed. Right? Questions of safety at work are going to be neglected. One hopes that there might be, that these will become flashpoints around which a newer politics will emerge. But this will remain to be seen. But if you look at the plight of the left in India, I mean, that is something that's, again, worth thinking about. I mean, it's one state in which the left has managed to actually organize itself where there is a notion of pastoral care. I mean, within Kerala, you have seen, I don't need to tell you, anyone who's read the newspapers knows how, but it's taken 40, 50 years or even more of a kind of devolution of power, setting up a panchayati raj, a politics of literacy, a politics of health, so which allows for this kind of notion of care to be pervasive in society. For India as a country at large, we think about what's happening in states like Uttar Pradesh. I mean, what you have is an abandonment, right? I mean, it's not very clear to me that a class politics will emerge there. What you have is a politics of power, right? As we've seen recently in the encounter killing of Vikas Dubey. Yes. He didn't even survive 24 hours of arrest.
Right. So we return to the question with which we started our conversation, which is about optimism that you have about academics in India. Likewise, would you be equally optimistic about the intellectual class in India? I mean, because there have been various kind of dominance of categories of mind and so forth, which has determined the way intellectuals have perceived India or have understood India. We also get to hear of the contestation which is happening in terms of value orientations. Marxist intelligentsia is fading away, or maybe have opted to selective silence. They will come back when the moment is, the occasion is better or safer, whatever they say. But there is another kind of intelligentsia which is rivaling to occupy that, center stage, and which would give us a different set of utopias. May not be very truthful to society, but they would have their own truth claims, so to say. So what kind of, how do we be hopeful with intellectuals in India? We have also noticed that there have been a lot of callousness about the emotions in the street. I mean, you mentioned some of those examples, or people dying on the railway track, and so many other things. But the responses have been very strange from intellectuals in India, right? And then, in addition to that, we are familiar with the kind of categories with which we operate habitually and conveniently. So I'm trying to provoke you to get back to your own days. I mean, you may have certain kind of nostalgia, but also not so sweet nostalgia at times about your own time when you were part of when you were actively you were residing in this kind of domain, and from there, how do you see it forward?
Yeah, I mean, these days everything is devalued. Even nostalgia isn't what it used to be, to borrow from Simone Signoret's autobiography. But I think, when it's a very Brahminical idea to think about the intellectual class. There is a kind of a needless emphasis and a wrong emphasis on the idea of there being intellectuals who have solutions to society, and that we need to be thinking more about what's happening. And I don't think that is something that we can work with in India, given the fault lines of power. That you have entire departments in universities where there have been no affirmative action policies followed, right, to begin with. Right? So it's 60 years into the formation of the history department at Delhi University. It took public interest litigation to actually have seats for scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, physically handicapped, etc. filled. So we know how Indian society functions. But given the fact that I suppose you mean by intellectuals people who reflect on society, right? And that's something that's not the privilege of journalists and professors and so on. This is something that's happening all around us. So from my experience, so for example, when I think about my experience of teaching at the University of Hyderabad, for example, right, where large numbers of the students were first generation into the university and who suddenly encountered an entire structure of knowledge which didn't speak about them, right? They might as well have been studying in the United States, where the idea of caste was never something that was taught centrally as a ontological fact, right? As an experiential fact. It was treated as something that was a matter of endogamy and very many procedural fact, but not as a question of experience. So what we are, I think, drawn towards, or what we should be drawn towards, is that if reflection, intellectual activity is to happen, it has to reflect the existing hierarchies and the existing experience of people around us. So if we are to think caste less through M. N. Srinivas and more through Rohit Vemula, right? What kind of knowledge does that produce?
Yes.
Right? The despair of somebody who, within an aspirational educational system, right, realizes that that system does not allow for the aspiration of certain people, right? And certain classes are excluded. They are within the structure and yet outside the structure. So I think that has to be the basis of all intellectual activity. And if that begins to happen, and I think here I don't look to my generation or indeed to anybody in the university really to produce this kind of information, because I think this is happening all around us.
Yes.
If you think about Chandrasekhar Azad, for example, you think about what is the appeal of somebody like that, and that the appeal of someone like that is somebody who speaks the truth to people about the abjection of lives, of everyday lives in India, and who's able to actually present that as the fundamental problem, not neoliberalism and not these kind of abstractions that we are so interested in, and which also allow for the participation of Indian intellectuals in larger intellectual paradigms, allowing them access to conferences and seminars elsewhere in the world, in Europe and America, and factor recognition. Why is it that academics who write about caste and about untouchability, right, have to translate it into a language of class because they feel that this is the only way I can become relevant? But that is the fundamental problem in India, right? And it is something that is irreducible. It's a quiddity. It's something that can't be easily translated into an experience elsewhere. Interestingly enough, this was something that was realized by Black sociologists. To go back to an earlier question that you asked me, people like W.B. Du Bois were speaking about being Black, being similar to the position of being an untouchable. So if you think about the present situation in India and the sheer abandonment of the poor, even the pettiness of domestic workers being let go and not being paid. I mean, this is our Indian middle class. It's a wretched society. Right? It's a wretched society where this question of hierarchy really means a complete non-cognizance of the human being around you. You think about things like that. You think about the abandonment of labor. You think about a whole set of situations where it's very clear what India is. It's a very, very hierarchical, inegalitarian, and violent society. We have to think about those who are beginning to reflect on this, who are not in the university, unfortunately, unhappily. They're not in the university. Right? Because the idea of ascending to the university or ascending to a job is to be unreflective of the violence that undergirds our very existence. Right? So I think that's where an intellectual activity will have to focus on. That's where intellectual activity is happening. And I'll stop with one more thing. One of the most interesting articles that I read recently was about TikTok videos, right? A whole sphere of life where migrant laborers produce and consume the various aspects of their living, whether it is song, dance, conversations, and this whole circulation that's happening, which we haven't caught up with, academics haven't caught up with. There is only condescension, There is a sentimentality regarding labor. There is the idea of what constitutes proper study, right? So if somebody were to come to a classic department in India and say, look, my thesis, I would like it to be on TikTok videos produced during the crisis, they might say, yeah, how does it connect up with the state, with neoliberalism, with capital? The fact of the everyday lives of deprivation are not by themselves, are not important, because we fail to see the imaginations that undergird these, right? That people are using these TikTok videos which are making sense. It's a bit like Jacques Rancier's book, right? Of the dreams of labor, that you have a proletarian, but they have an entire world of imagination that makes life sustainable, right, for them. So it's questions like that. We need a new kind of intellectual activity, a new kind of non-elite intellectual activity. And I think the fact of a politics that will emerge from outside of these traditional, conventional kinds of expectations. What will the left do now? What is the role for me as an intellectual? I think to think about oneself as being largely irrelevant, unless one can actually tap in to this wellspring that's out there.
Wonderful. So to end this, I always wonder what kind of, in the line of this last thing you said, I always wonder how scholars, academics are trying to maintain their sense of humor. What kind of humor occupies their mind these days? And there are plenty of them all around us. And a lot of them are coming from various kind of sources, including TikTok and all kind of new YouTube stars, unheard of stars, but quite productive and very straight to the point, hitting at all those bullseyes, which scholars would not like to, for various kind of preferences and safe politics that they would do. So what kind of sense of humor Professor Menon maintains these days? I mean, what kind of jokes?
What kind of joke? You want me to tell you a joke? No. Well, actually, I've been watching a lot of political stand-up comedy, because one of the best things about having a comedian as prime minister is that it produces rival comedy. So you have, if you think about the whole range of people from Kunal Kamra onwards who have been doing excellent political comedy. And I think what it taps into is also a strain of humor that's present in all of us. But one of the burdens of being an intellectual, people are afraid to laugh. I've noticed this in seminars as well. You say something funny and everybody is wondering, okay, should I laugh or should I not? Right? I mean, the idea that somehow, if you are a serious intellectual, laughter should be far from you.
Yeah.
And for me, this is one of the most important things that has kept me going, that, whether it's watching a lot of the political comedy or whether it's looking at cartoons. And I think it's also become very difficult for cartoonists in India to raise a laugh. There isn't much to laugh about, right? And this is what O.V. Vijayan, the great political cartoonist, said, is that my profession demands that I laugh, but the situation around me gives me no cause for laughter. And which is why I think the whole emergence of political comedy has emerged because of the sheer darkness of the situation.
Right.
You need to laugh. Right? If you think about the darkest times under the Soviet Union, if you think about Eastern Europe, produced the best humor. And now authoritarianism is over. Very few jokes are coming out of Eastern Europe. Right? And the reason why Slavoj Žižek's jokes are so funny is because they come from a past of authoritarianism. I mean, sweet are the uses of adversity, as Shakespeare might say. This is not to suggest that authoritarianism is necessary for creativity. Yeah. But I think what has happened is that in these situations, people want to laugh. And that's why you think about all the circulation of TikTok videos, which is why I think Modi has struck at the very heart of Indian creativity by banning TikTok. I don't know whether you saw all of those videos where people are saying, they've lost their livelihood. Paisa kahan se aayega? It's like they made a livelihood out of producing stuff. And so around us, there is humor. Just as much as around us, there is this devastation that is happening. And these are connected. Connected. Because this laughter that allows us to live through this. If we couldn't laugh, then I think that we wouldn't be able to survive. And laughter demands that we let out that breath, which COVID is choking, right?
Yes.
Each time we laugh and we let out we know we are alive. So I think that's really where, for me, humor is what's kept me going. But then I'm of that kind of temperament. As I said, optimism and laughter govern my existence.
No, it's really important to hear all these things. Because this whole act of letting it out is so very important for all of us, and particularly again I would say intellectual class, which is constipated by itself class for a variety of reasons. So thanks a lot, Professor Menon. I have taken a lot of your time. And
thank you, Dave. Thanks for this informal conversation. I'm glad we could talk like this instead of a proper seminar.